Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of How Round Is Your Roti? Today, I'm joined by Anita Patel, who is a neuro inclusion and intersectionality speaker, trainer, and neurodiversity coach. She has both professional and lived experience of neurodivergence, which we'll hear about today. Hi, Anita. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Priya. Thanks so much for having me.
I know we have a lot of things to speak about today, and I think this is a topic that is highly relevant in society today. It seems that we have more awareness about neurodiversity, but perhaps in South Asian communities, we've shied away from openly talking about it. So I'm very interested to hear, firstly, your story and how you got to where you are now as a trainer, speaker, and coach.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, in terms of where to begin, really, so I think it was probably missed in myself. So, I received a late diagnosis of both autism and ADHD a few years ago. But I think I was doing a lot of masking over the years, a lot of people pleasing, perfectionism. And I think I probably suppressed quite a bit of how my co-occurring neurotypes were working. And I think it wasn't until I started doing more work in this space that I started researching more and discovering things. And then that coincided with me mentoring neurodivergent students at the University of Leicester. And a lot of the women in particular were saying things like, you really get this, it's like holding a mirror up. I feel like you've been there. So then I thought, okay, that there might be something to this. In addition to that, I received a diagnosis of breast cancer 6 years ago. And that sent me into a chemical menopause because of the treatment. As a result, it made it a lot harder to mask in addition. So, some of the aspects, the sensory overload, the executive functioning challenges, some of the things which we do come across in the perimenopause and menopause, that was sort of everything. The treatment that I was on was magnifying the neurodivergence in a way. And it really sort of became more apparent. And that's when I changed paths completely. So I was teaching for many years. I was in education settings, and I then decided to start my own business. So I gained a coaching diploma and lots of additional sort of neurodiversity training, and decided that actually that would become my area. It just sort of happened really organically through me realizing that I was neurodivergent, and then people kind of coming to me who wanted support. And it started off as sort of one-to-one work, but now it's much, much wider with organizations and really thinking about neuro inclusion. So yeah, it's been a bit of a journey, but I'm really happy that I'm where I want to be now.
You've been through a lot. I mean, breast cancer alone, such a big thing. And then to also have those symptoms of being neurodiverse coming in with it. I mean, how did you cope through that period?
That was particularly challenging because I think understanding that there was this almost overnight thing that had happened. I'd been put on this treatment, and because I had estrogen positive breast cancer, the idea was that they had to really kind of take control of those estrogen levels and bring them right down. And there were kind of other things that were happening to me with surgeries and that kind of thing. So all of that combined meant that the co-occurring neurotypes that I have, the autism and the ADHD, certain aspects of that became so much more apparent on a daily basis. So whether it was, for example, experiencing things with my senses, whether it was sort of planning and organizing. So of course I decided to start my own business, change paths completely. And that was a lot in itself. But having to then go and find clients, market myself, do the admin, all of that side of things. Whilst I love what I do now because it means I can make adaptations better by working for myself, it was a steep learning curve because there was a lot happening which made certain challenges difficult to manage without the right support, which is why I then started to seek out neuro affirming support that could help me, rather than, for example, when it was really, really extreme, it was the sort of implication that there were things happening with my mental health and that maybe I should see someone accordingly, when actually it wasn't that. It was that I had a different way of processing information, a different way of working, a different way of seeing the world, and I needed support to match that. So once I started getting that, it made such a difference. And then that made me determined to help more people in that way, to show that they're not broken, they don't need fixing. There's just a different type of understanding that they need.
It's so interesting to hear that journey that you've gone on. I want to just go back a moment because you said that your diagnosis was later in life. And I think just from reports out there, news reports, there seems to be more people being diagnosed later in life. That, as you said, women quite clever at masking their symptoms. Could you describe a little bit about what masking is and how people generally go through that process and maybe are not even aware that they have some neurodivergent qualities?
Absolutely. So I think for me, growing up, I was always seen as the academic one, the one that would kind of get on with her homework and just blend into the background. All of the school reports were generally quite positive. She just she does what she needs to do, essentially. And that happened for quite some time. And I think particularly in our community, the whole sort of expectations around academic performance and success. And whilst my own parents weren't necessarily that way inclined, I was part of a bigger sort of framework of this is what doing well looks like. So all of those messages kind of coming through, the well dones and all of that side of things made me think that that was really the only measure of me continuing to be successful. And so I did suppress quite a bit. Masking is very much wanting to fit into a neurotypical world. So you feel like you have to kind of keep certain things in and alter some of your ways. So friendships in particular were quite challenging. I'm happy to say that I have some really lovely friends in my life now, in my later years. But certainly growing up, feeling like I had to alter who I was to be liked more, to be accepted, to be validated. Whereas now I can be much more authentic in terms of how I speak about my neurodivergence in friendships. And it's met with a lot of sort of compassion and curiosity, but I'm not sure I would have felt safe to do that in, for example, my teenage years. So that there has sometimes that high level of masking can lead to additional challenges with, for example, your mental health. And so you're misdiagnosed. You're seen as having mental health difficulties and treated in that way when actually they are as a result of you not being able to work with your neurotypes.
There's a lot to consider there because I think, especially the way we're raised, quite similar, that emphasis on education, what success looks like. So for people to almost disentangle themselves from that and look at just their individuality and what's occurring, that sounds like a really important thing to do. In terms of when you had your diagnosis and then I mean, at the moment, you've made it part of your business, you speak quite openly about it, but what were the reactions that you got from the South Asian community, whether it was friends, families, or people that you work with?
Very mixed. So my own family, so my immediate family, my husband, my boys, we have what I call a very sort of neuro-affirming setup now. We really explore what it is that we need, what works well, what doesn't. So it's in that sense a safe space. And then sort of outside of that, I would say that my dad, for example, my mum is no longer with us. She passed 18 years ago, sadly, from breast cancer. But my dad, as soon as he got the report after I received my diagnosis, because I went for an assessment and there was a very detailed report, Dad got the highlighters out and he wanted to know more. He wanted to understand. And even now, he'll continue to ask questions about what works well and what doesn't. However, there have also been reactions in a different way. So, things along the lines of, but you don't look it. You've managed all of these years. Why do you need this now? So I think there was a lot of kind of, well, is this helpful for you currently? You can just carry on. When actually it's been life-changing for me to have this understanding and to be able to advocate for myself, and not constantly go into that pattern of sort of people-pleasing perfection, and then sometimes even burnout because you're trying to do it all and say yes to everything. So I think certainly real variations, and we see this in certain parts of the community. Topics like this, whether it's neurodivergence or mental health or even cancer, something that indicates that you are less than, it's a very deficit-based approach. And sometimes there's a bit of denial as well. So it's kind of like, well, we don't need to talk about that. It will go away. When actually I've had this since birth, and more than likely, there is a large hereditary element to neurodivergence. So people start to then kind of look at other family members and wonder whether there's something there. So, there's that side of things. And I think I have learned to make my peace with it, because initially I found that quite hard and quite isolating. But then a lot of other South Asian women in particular, interestingly, started to reach out and started to kind of share their stories. And they'd say things like, yeah, I find cooking for lots of people really challenging too, on a sensory level. Or I find going to large weddings really challenging. Or I find, unexpected visitors coming around, I find that hard. And we started to kind of build a bit of a community. And, I think that's really important, because otherwise it can feel quite lonely.
Relate to some of those things that you said, and I'm sure some women, if they were interested in exploring this further, what advice would you give them?
I think absolutely, if you start to feel certain things in certain situations, so that, for example, you have strengths, you have things that you do extremely well. So whilst I don't call them my superpowers, because I think actually that comes with certain connotations, because some days are really hard, I do have what I call super strengths. And I know that if I'm supported well and I have the right environment, I can do really well with certain tasks, my work, being creative and, pursuing different options and seeing connections and things. But it's what I call a spiky profile. So some days are fantastic and some days are really hard. And if you are dysregulated, you have found that on a sensory level, your environment's not quite right, or quite a lot of unpredictable things have happened in a short space of time that are not in your control, or you have a large amount of work to get through, and the ADHD part of my brain wants to say yes to everything and thinks it's all wonderful, and the autistic side is going, slow down, you need a bit of routine, you need a little bit of familiarity. So there's that kind of push-pull. So if you start to feel that you have what we call that kind of spikiness of actually sometimes this is going brilliantly, and sometimes I feel like I just need to hide away from the world. And I find things difficult that other people don't seem to. So, what is that? What does that mean? How does it make me feel? And I think particularly if you are at a later stage in your life where you have spent many years caring for children, caring for other family members, perhaps putting your needs last in some situations, to then really say, actually, what is it that I'm feeling? Do I feel a difference? Is there something that probably needs a bit more support? And even if it's not a formal diagnosis, even if you're just what I call discovering, then allowing for that to happen, giving yourself the space to do that.
That's really important. And I speak to lots of women who are actually in a similar stage to us, a little bit later in life, have children, and now are finding that time and finding ways to discover what's important to them or how they react to certain situations, why they're feeling quite stressed. Is it, things going on in the background that they've not confronted before? So it's really interesting that you've recommended things like that, just stepping back and giving time for yourself. I think in our younger years, it's so much about career, marriage, kids, and you're just on a roller coaster with it all. And I'm finding now, I've just turned 40, that actually my kids are now slightly a bit older, got a bit more time, a bit more space to think about myself. And I think that it is this group of women now that, excuse me, are thinking about themselves and how they want to live and where the barriers are coming up for them there. So if you know people who are neurodivergent, say they're friends or families, what would you say, or how would you say we can better support those people if they've come out and said, "Oh, I have this diagnosis"? Because some of us, if we shied away from those conversations, might not know how to best support them. What advice would you give there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that having better understanding of what neurodivergence actually looks and feels like, because you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one. So not making those assumptions and generalizations that, for example, autistic individuals will always have this or struggle with this. And really thinking about the kind of deficit side of it, that actually there are so many things to counter that. So understanding the whole picture, that yes, there are struggles, but there are also strengths. And if you are, for example, whether it's gender variations, whether it's something to do with any physical health challenges you have, whether you've experienced a big sort of change in your life, you might present differently. You might not show certain signs. You may still be masking. You may not have had a safe space to really explore. So understanding the bigger picture, and that's why I focus so much on intersectionality, those identities that impact how we show up and how we experience things. And then I think adjusting your expectations in terms of what, being successful and good in inverted commas looks like, that you've managed to pursue this career for such a long time. Wow. You have attended all of these events weekend after weekend. That's brilliant. You've hosted so and so in an unexpected way. That's really great. All of those things might be really hard for a neurodivergent individual. That doesn't mean that they are being difficult or deliberately opting out or, wanting to kind of completely be on their own path. They might be dealing with not only thinking about themselves, but maybe they've got children who are, and maybe their children are needing support above and beyond. So to kind of meet them where they are and maybe make the accommodations that you can. So, for example, if you know that it might be problematic showing up to their house unexpectedly, you might want to give a little bit of notice. Or if you know that hosting on a big scale might be challenging, you may say, don't worry, we'll bring some food too, or we'll just get some food from outside because it's more important that we see you, not everything that you're able to put on the table, where you'll be so tired where we won't actually get to spend quality time. And then just to kind of stay curious and compassionate in your approach. So to kind of ask the questions. So a lot of my friends now, whether they are neurodivergent or neurotypical, there's always that approach of, what is it that you need? And tell me more. So I think all of that combined can make such a difference.
Yeah, it just brings another level of awareness. If you know someone, they're an individual. You can't just put a broad brush against and say this is what they're going to be like and just assume things. Getting to know that person as an individual and meeting some of their needs in a really considerate way. And I think perhaps we all need to act a bit more like that. I know you also do some work within organizations.
Mm.
And I think that obviously children go through school that are neurodivergent, and there are certain setups that they'll need in school. But in organizations, this is becoming more applicable, more relevant of a topic. What would you like to see change in organizations to support people who are neurodivergent? And again, with all the nuances involved there, what can
Yeah,
organizations do?
absolutely. Well, so much is possible. So if we think about school settings, for example, currently there are a lot of children who are going through exams, whether it's GCSEs, whether it's A levels, mocks, or kind of end of primary school exams. That in itself puts a lot of pressure on neurodivergent children and their parents and carers, because that system of turning up day after day and sitting in silence for those few hours and having to perform without being able to kind of access things that you need to keep you regulated, that's really tough. So and that measures your success, that allows you to take the next steps. But what about those neurodivergent children who actually have so much more to offer and they have so much potential in other areas? And then the wider school system, there's a big emphasis on sort of consequences. You receive credit and you receive stickers and stars and certificates, and then sanctions. But is that measured against neurotypical expectations or wider ones, that actually allow for more creativity? If you're giving someone constant praise for having 100% attendance, there could be a very good reason why they weren't able to attend every single day. So it's kind of celebrating some of the other things that our children can bring. So that's very much in a sort of a school setting. And then in workplaces, we see a whole range. We see really good practice, which is what I call very neuro-affirming, where you're not just including neurodivergent individuals, you're celebrating them. So you're going one step further and tapping into their talent. And then you see other organizations who treat it more as a sort of tick box exercise. Somebody will come in, they'll deliver a session, but you wonder how much that's going to be embedded throughout the year. What will be the next steps that are taken to ensure that that work continues? So I think very much sort of having a culture that can not only accepts and includes, but it really sort of embraces everything that we can bring. Because, it's estimated that around 20% of the population is neurodivergent. More than likely, it is greater than that. So, that's a large number that we need to really sort of think about, and very much through an intersectional lens. So, for example, if you have got someone who is from the global majority, so, previously known, or still some people use the term ethnic minority, but I tend to use global majority because if you think about all of these marginalized communities across the whole world, we form the majority. And that has to be taken into account, our unique experiences, like you say, the nuances. And alongside that, you might have somebody who is experiencing things to do with their gender. They might be in the LGBTQ plus category. They might need a different lens, or you might have somebody who has something going on with their career, which means that they have to kind of stop altogether. They can't continue because they haven't had the right support. So when they go into a different work setting, that previous experience, and actually possibly even some trauma that's carried, has to be taken into account. Was it a safe enough space for them to explore their neurodivergence? And then I think things like life stages, so going through the perimenopause and menopause, that's a growing area that's being looked at right now. The relationship between your hormones and your neurodivergence, what does that look like and feel like? So I'm currently kind of delivering some bits around that, where people often say, well, is it the perimenopause and menopause, or is it ADHD or autism or another type of neurodivergence? Because actually there are so many. You can either have co-occurring neurotypes, or you can have other conditions like OCD, and everything comes under that, that umbrella. But if you've also got something huge that's happening inside you with regards to your hormones, you might need a different level of understanding. So I think really kind of continuing to keep yourself, whether you are in a school setting or a workplace setting, keep having the training, absolutely. Bring in people who've got lived experience, which makes a huge difference, because you are providing examples and bringing things to life, but also continue that journey and make it clear right from the sort of recruitment stage that we welcome you.
That's definitely something organizations should be doing and hopefully are taking into account. If you're a woman going into an organization at any stage, how would you say that they should advocate for themselves? If they've got it on their CV, I'm not sure if they feel comfortable or not at that stage, or if it comes out later and they're already employed. And maybe perhaps they want to ask for some adjustments and it's not something that's known within the organization. How would you say they could go about that if they wanted to?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I get asked a lot. So you can still access support without a formal diagnosis, which a lot of people don't know. You're still entitled to it. So if you are in a position to make some kind of disclosure to your organization, you feel that that's okay, you might choose to frame it as, I'm neurodivergent and I have these are my, this is my neurotype. Or you might have, as I have in my case, I'm ADHD, so I have the co-occurring neurotypes. You may be able to say it in that way, but if you still find that challenging, there are ways to advocate for your needs in terms of the specific things you need help with. So whether it's, for example, executive functioning, if it's to do with the types of tasks you're being given, how much time you're given to sort of complete them. Or is it a communication thing where if you're on Teams calls back to back and you're expected to participate in every single one, at some point that's going to prove really challenging. You're going to need some time to process in between. Or whether it's, for example, on a sensory level, is it your environment? Is it, for example, the lighting or the noise levels or things that you find triggering that actually are stopping you from being your best and working the way you'd like to? So there are adjustments that can be made to your actual physical environment, but other adjustments that can be made according to how information is delivered to you and what the expectations are in terms of timescales. So one really big thing that we often come across amongst it can be many neurodivergent individuals, but particularly with ADHD, there's something called RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria. And that is something that you experience. It's an acute sense of rejection, almost painful, that you feel when that person didn't necessarily intend to reject you, but you are seeing it in that manner. So in a workplace setting, you could have a performance review, for example, which is very much according to neurotypical criteria, the way that you're sort of, graded or assessed. That can really trigger your RSD because you're thinking, well, I mean, I'm trying, but I can't do that completely because that's going against my neurotype. Or you might get some feedback from someone. You might get an email that you misinterpret. You think this is a rejection. This means this has been terrible. And actually, I don't know if I need to continue in this job, or I think I may lose my job. So it's being mindful of that and making sure that if you need more check-ins, you ask for them. Check-ins shouldn't just be when you're doing things wrong, and that's what I've experienced. I think having experienced two environments, one which was very much, we will only tell you when you're doing something you shouldn't be, and the other environment, which was, I would like to see you on a regular basis to also tell you how well you're doing. And I'd like to just see how you're getting on. And those regular check-ins made a huge difference because it meant that I could vocalize more of what was working well for me and what wasn't. So we changed, for example, the back-to-back stuff. We changed my the space that I was working in, because where the office that I had was very close to a corridor and there was a lot of movement. So that was an easy fix. And we had other things that would help me to maintain my energy levels. So when it was, for example, some of the admin side, what could we do there? What could we do to make it less onerous? And then I think all of that combined means that someone will give you their best. And particularly as a woman, if you've spent years not being able to advocate and, blending in and pushing things, kind of suppressing them to an extent, you might find that hard initially because it may not come to you naturally. But I think as you sort of do what I call safe experiments, so you do them in kind of some settings where you feel you can, and there isn't so much of a risk, you sort of begin there, and then it starts to kind of have a ripple effect and you feel more able to do it in other contexts.
That's really good to hear. And I'm just wondering, when it came to having those adjustments, did they come from you suggesting it, or was there cooperation from where you were working? Did they come up with ideas themselves? Just in terms of that balance of how it worked for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the environment where it was very neuroaffirming, it was very much a two-way process, which I think adjustments should be, because I think if you place it all on the individual, and especially if you ask a question like, what help do you need?
Exactly.
What support do you need? That's quite intimidating, and that's quite difficult to actually answer, especially if you are neurodivergent. It's a very closed question and you may not know. But if you change that and you ask something like, how best can we support you? And then start to actually explore with them what different scenarios look like. So, when you have a really busy week, what does that look like and how do you feel? Or when it's a bit quieter, what can happen there? Or when you're feeling stressed or you're feeling, really accomplished with your work, what does that look like? What does that mean for you? And asking those types of questions and really getting to know the individual. Also, as you know, with coaching, it's about reading between what's actually being said. Is there an additional layer of masking happening there where they're telling you what they think you want to hear because they've done that for so many years. And it's kind of, what can we do to really understand what's happening under the surface and create a space where that person doesn't feel like they have to suppress everything, you know? And I think that takes time. It's a two-way relationship, but once you start experiencing the impact of doing that, you realize you can never go back.
And at least then you're in a position where you know what you need and what support's beneficial to you, so that if you ever do move to another workplace, you can be better at advocating for yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you, and it's not always easy, you might have certain settings which don't allow you to do that, but then having a community, I find really helps. So if, for example, I've been in a situation where I felt I wasn't fully myself, I wasn't really fully articulate about everything in that situation, I will then sort of decompress with someone who I trust, you know, a safe person, and we'll take some learning from that and we'll think about what we'll do differently the next time. Because, you know, we may not, even if we try, there may be something that comes our way which doesn't allow us to access that toolbox that we've acquired. That's okay. You know, we just go back to the drawing board, have a little bit of a conversation with the right people and figure out how you might sort of do that differently in the future.
Anita, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast firstly and sharing your story. Like I said, it is not a topic that we hear personal experiences about that often. You're the first person I've spoken to, where you've talked about your experiences, what you've gone through, and also now you're in a space where you're advocating for others, working with people, and raising awareness in organisations. So I think it's such a commendable role that you've got. So thank you so much for being here today. And I will obviously share details where this episode is going to be posted if anybody does want to contact you for coaching or training or even speaking to an organisation, because I think you're doing a tremendous amount of good out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya. I've really loved this. And I absolutely love the name. And just to kind of say, it doesn't matter if your roti is not perfectly round. It
Exactly.
is okay.
Okay. Definitely. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye.